Snow was falling in soft, deliberate flakes, turning the quiet streets of the small Ohio town into something that looked almost magical. Emily stood at the front door of her aunt and uncle's house, clutching the handle of her small suitcase. She had been invited to spend Christmas with them for the first time in 4 years, and although the idea filled her with quiet sort of hope, there was also a weight in her chest, a mix of anticipation and uncertainty that came with being a guest, not quite belonging in someone else's family home. The warmth of the house hit her the moment she stepped inside. The smell of cinnamon, roasted turkey, and fresh pine wrapped around her like a blanket. Laughter spilled from the living room where her younger cousins played near the tree, their cheeks pink from running around. Her aunt greeted her with a polite smile, and her uncle gave her a firm, brief hug. There was kindness there, but also a certain formality, an unspoken reminder that she was here on invitation, not by right. As the evening wore on, Emily tried to settle into the rhythm of the family's traditions. She helped set the table, refilled glasses, and even joined in when they sang carols, though her voice was quiet and careful. They sat down to dinner, the long table covered in glistening dishes, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce that shimmered like garnet stones. The conversation was light at first, touching on weather, school, and work. But like most family gatherings, it drifted into more personal territory. Emily was halfway through her plate when her cousin Sarah, just a year older than her, leaned back in her chair, swirling a glass of wine between her fingers. Sarah had always been the one with the perfect hair, the perfect grades, the easy confidence that made her seem untouchable. She was smiling, though not warmly, when she said, "You know, Emily, you're not really part of the family. I mean, not in the same way the rest of us are." The words were said lightly, as if they were some harmless joke, but they hit Emily like a blade. For a second, the sounds around her seemed to fade, the clinking of cutlery, the crackle of the fireplace, even the hum of conversation. She stared at Sarah, her throat tightening, unsure whether to defend herself or simply pretend she hadn't heard. No one at the table laughed, but no one contradicted Sarah either. Her aunt cleared her throat and changed the subject, moving the conversation along as though nothing had happened. Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to take another bite of food she could no longer taste. She kept her eyes down for the rest of the meal, nodding when spoken to, smiling when it seemed expected. Every so often she caught Sarah glancing at her with that same faint smirk, as though daring her to say something. By the time dessert was served, Emily's chest ached from holding back tears. That night, when everyone had gone to bed, she sat alone in the small guest room, staring at the suitcase in the corner. She had come here hoping to feel a piece of the warmth she'd lost when her parents died, but now that hope felt foolish. She thought about her mother's laugh, her father's terrible Christmas sweaters, and the way their home had always felt like a place she belonged without question. The absence of that love was a wound that hadn't fully healed, and Sarah's careless words had pressed hard against it. In the pale light of morning, Emily made her decision. She packed her things quietly, careful not to wake anyone. The house was still, the only sound a faint ticking of a clock in the hallway. She left a polite note for her aunt and uncle, thanking them for the evening, and stepped outside into the cold. Her breath rose in small clouds as she walked down the street toward the bus stop, the snow crunching softly under her boots. When she reached her small apartment later that day, the silence felt different than it had before. It wasn't comforting. It was heavy, almost suffocating. She set her suitcase down and sat on the couch, staring at the bare walls. Christmas was still 2 days away, but she decided she would spend it alone. No family dinners, no forced smiles, no pretending she belonged somewhere she didn't. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry without restraint, letting the hurt seep out like slow, steady rain. That Christmas marked the moment Emily truly understood the difference between being invited into someone's life and being part of it. It was the beginning of a quiet but resolute determination, though she didn't yet know it, that she would one day create her own version of family, one that no one could question, no matter what they share by blood. The days after Christmas passed in a muted blur. Emily returned to her routine, but it was a routine without warmth. Her small apartment became a quiet refuge, not because it was comfortable, but because it asked nothing of her. She woke before dawn, dressed quickly in the dim light, and walked to a cafe where she worked the morning shift. The air inside was always thick with the scent of coffee and baked bread, and though customers came and went in a constant stream, the work kept her mind focused. When the shift ended, she would grab a quick lunch, usually something cheap, eaten on the walk to her second job at a bookstore downtown. The shop had creaky wooden floors, shelves stacked high with novels, and a lingering smell of paper and dust. She liked the quiet there, the way the city's noise seemed to stop at the door. The owner, an older man named Frank, spoke to her in short, polite sentences, never asking about her life outside the shop. She appreciated that. At night, she attended classes at the community college, sitting in the back row, taking careful notes. Her classmates often grouped together for projects or study sessions, but she rarely joined. It wasn't that she disliked people. She simply no longer sought the kind of closeness that could leave her exposed. Her world had become carefully measured. Work, study, sleep, repeat. It was lonely, but it was safe. One rainy evening, while waiting for the bus after class, she noticed a flyer taped to the shelter wall. The paper was damp at the edges, but the words were still legible. Volunteers needed, women's shelter. The address was only a few blocks from her apartment. She pulled the flyer down and tucked it into her bag without really knowing why. That weekend, she walked to the shelter and introduced herself to the woman at the front desk. Her name was Carla, and she had a voice like gravel softened by kindness. "You want to help?" Carla asked, looking her over as if to measure her sincerity. "Yes," Emily said simply. The work was not glamorous. She folded donated clothes, served meals, and scrubbed dishes until her fingers were wrinkled from the hot water. But there was something different about being there. The shelter was full of women whose lives had been fractured in ways that made Emily's own pain feel both smaller and more connected to something larger. She listened to their stories, some spoken in trembling voices, others in matter-of-fact tones, and began to understand that survival often had little to do with the strength people saw on the surface. Over the months, she started volunteering at other places too. A food pantry, a literacy program for immigrant women, a hotline for domestic abuse survivors. She wasn't looking for friendship, but in the quiet exchanges, passing a cup of coffee to someone, teaching a stranger how to sign their name, she began to feel a flicker of something she had almost forgotten: purpose. Her schedule grew heavier, but she didn't mind. She cut her expenses to the bone, keeping only what she needed for rent, food, and tuition. Everything else went into savings. She didn't have a clear plan yet, but the idea was beginning to take shape in her mind, a place that could offer the kind of stability she wished she'd had when her own life had fallen apart. Not just a shelter, but a home in the truest sense, warm, safe, and without judgment. One night, sitting at her kitchen table with the city lights flickering through the blinds, she began sketching ideas in a notebook, pages filled with lists, services that could be offered, ways to make the space inviting, programs that could help women rebuild their independence. She imagined rooms painted in soft colors, a kitchen that smelled of fresh bread, a library filled with books on everything from child care to starting a small business. It would take years. She knew that. She would need funding, training, and a clear plan. But for the first time in a long while, her life felt as though it was moving toward something. The loneliness was still there, but it had shifted, no longer a heavy weight pressing her down. Instead, it was a space she could fill with purpose. Emily didn't talk about her dream to anyone yet. Some dreams are too fragile in their early stages, too easily crushed by skepticism or casual dismissal. So she kept working, kept saving, kept learning, and slowly, without realizing it, she was building not just a plan for a future refuge, but also the resilience to bring it to life. By the time 2 years had passed, the woman who had once left a family dinner in silence was no longer the same. She was quieter in some ways, but stronger in others, her resolve sharpened by the understanding that belonging wasn't something the world gave you. It was something you could create, even if you had to build it from nothing. By the time Emily turned 28, the dream that had once existed only in the margins of a worn notebook had begun to take shape in the real world. The years of disciplined saving, relentless work, and quiet planning had brought her to a point where the impossible felt within reach. She had found a small, aging building on the edge of the city, a former community center that had been shuttered for years. Its paint was peeling, the windows clouded with dust, and the air inside smelled faintly of damp wood. But Emily saw through the decay. She saw wide rooms filled with light, hallways echoing with voices, and a kitchen where laughter would rise like steam. It took every cent she had saved, along with a modest grant she had applied for, and won after months of filling out forms and refining proposals. When she signed the final papers, she stood alone in the main hall, her footsteps echoing against the bare walls. For a moment, she simply breathed in the silence, letting the enormity of the decision settle over her. This was no longer a dream. This was a commitment, one she would see through no matter the cost. Renovation began almost immediately. Emily wasn't afraid of physical work. She painted walls, scrubbed floors, and hauled boxes of donated furniture up creaking stairs. Volunteers trickled in, friends of friends, former colleagues from the bookstore and cafe, even a few women she had once met at the shelter. Together they worked long hours, often late into the night, fueled by takeout meals and the shared satisfaction of watching the place transform. The smell of fresh paint replaced the mustiness, and the dusty windows were cleaned until sunlight poured through in warm, golden streams. She decided on a name after weeks of consideration: Harbor Hands Foundation. It felt right, safe, steady, like a place where you could anchor yourself after drifting too long in dangerous waters. The mission was clear in her mind, to provide more than just temporary aid. She wanted to give women the tools to rebuild their lives, skills, education, and, above all, a sense of belonging. The day the doors officially opened, the winter air was sharp and cold, but inside, the atmosphere was warm. The lobby smelled faintly of cinnamon from a batch of cookies baking in the kitchen. Small potted plants lined the windowsills, and a bulletin board displayed flyers for classes: resume writing, basic computer skills, budgeting, and parenting workshops. Emily greeted each woman who walked in with the same gentle handshake and steady eye contact, making sure they felt seen, not scrutinized. Over the following weeks, the center began to hum with life. In the mornings, the classrooms filled with the soft scratching of pencils and the murmur of focused discussion. In the afternoons, the kitchen buzzed with the sound of chopping vegetables and clinking pots as volunteers prepared shared meals. Evenings brought quieter moments. Women sitting together in the common room, reading or talking in low voices. Children playing in the corner under the watchful eye of a volunteer. Emily spent her days moving from one room to another, checking in on classes, fixing leaky faucets, organizing donations, and making sure no one felt left behind. She learned their names, their children's names, and the small details that made them individuals, not just cases in a file. There was Marisol, who had left an unsafe home with nothing but a backpack; Claire, who was trying to finish her high school diploma; and Denise, who had arrived shy and guarded but now taught a sewing class twice a week. Word spread quickly. Local newspapers wrote about the center, praising its welcoming atmosphere. A journalist described it as a home disguised as a foundation, and Emily kept that clipping in her desk drawer as a quiet reminder of her purpose. But with recognition came longer lines outside the door. There were more women seeking help than she had space for, and though it pained her, she sometimes had to place names on a waiting list. She worked tirelessly, but there were moments when exhaustion caught up with her. On one particularly long night, after everyone had gone home, she sat in the kitchen alone, a mug of lukewarm tea in her hands. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. She thought about the path that had led her here, the sacrifices, the years of saving, the risks, and yet, despite the weight of it all, she felt a deep, unshakable certainty. This was where she was meant to be. Emily knew the Harbor Hands Foundation was still fragile, still growing, but it was alive. It had roots now, and those roots were beginning to spread. She didn't yet know that one of the women who would soon walk through its doors would challenge her in a way she had never expected. Not because of who they were now, but because of the history they shared. The first real snow of the season had begun to fall, brushing the city in white and muffling its usual noise. From her office window, Emily could see the women in the courtyard shuffling along the salted path, their breaths turning to pale clouds. It was December again, the busiest month of the year for the Harbor Hands Foundation. Winter brought both an influx of donations and a heavier tide of women seeking shelter from more than just the cold. The air inside was thick with movement. Children's laughter echoing down the hallways, the clang of pots in the kitchen, the hum of conversation in classrooms. Emily thrived in this rhythm, though she rarely paused long enough to notice the fatigue building in her bones. That morning, she was reviewing intake forms when she heard Carla, now one of her most trusted staff members, call her name from the lobby. Emily set the papers aside and walked out, expecting to meet a new volunteer or perhaps a donor. Instead, she stopped short. Standing near the reception desk was a woman holding a bundled infant in her arms, her hair pulled back in a messy knot, her coat worn and thin. At first, Emily's mind refused to connect the image before her with the memory it stirred. But then the woman looked up, and there was no mistaking her. Sarah. The years had altered her, softening some edges and hardening others. The confident tilt of her chin was gone, replaced by a careful stillness, as though she were afraid of taking up too much space. Her eyes were shadowed by exhaustion, and her arms tightened protectively around the baby, who whimpered softly against her chest. For a moment, neither spoke. The memory of a dinner table years ago, of words spoken with casual cruelty, rose unbidden in Emily's mind. She could almost hear them, sharp and cold, but she pushed them back. "Emily," Sarah said finally, her voice quieter than Emily remembered. "I didn't know this place was yours." Emily glanced toward Carla, who had stepped discreetly aside, sensing the weight in the air. "Why don't we sit down?" Emily said, her tone even. She led Sarah to a small table near the corner of the lobby, away from the flow of people coming in and out. The baby stirred, and Sarah adjusted the blanket, her hands trembling slightly. "I wouldn't be here if I had anywhere else to go," Sarah admitted, her gaze fixed on the tabletop. "I left. Things weren't safe. For me, for him." She nodded toward the infant. "We've been staying with a friend, but she can't keep us much longer." Emily listened without interrupting. Her chest felt tight, not with anger, but with a complicated mix of emotions she didn't have time to sort through. Years ago, she had walked away from Sarah's world, deciding she wanted no part in it. Now Sarah was sitting in hers, asking for help, and the balance between them had shifted completely. "We can go through the intake process," Emily said after a moment. "We'll see what space we have and what resources we can connect you with. It's busy right now, but we'll do what we can." Sarah's eyes flicked up, meeting hers for the first time. "I don't expect special treatment," she said quickly, almost offensively. Emily nodded. "That's good, because no one here gets special treatment. Everyone gets what they need, if we can give it. That's the only rule." For the rest of the conversation, Emily kept her focus on logistics, forms to fill out, temporary housing arrangements, childcare options for when Sarah needed to attend workshops. She didn't address the past. Not yet. There would be time for that, if it needed to be spoken about at all. Later, after Sarah had been shown to her room and the baby was sleeping in a borrowed crib, Emily returned to her office. She closed the door and let herself lean back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The sight of her cousin had stirred things she had long thought settled. But she also knew something else. The foundation existed for moments exactly like this. If she had built it for anyone, it was for people who had nowhere else to turn, even if those people were pieces of her past she had never expected to see again. The snow outside kept falling, soft and unrelenting, covering the streets in a pale, unbroken sheet. Somewhere down the hall, Sarah was beginning her first night in a place Emily had once only imagined. And Emily, despite everything, felt certain that she had done the right thing by opening the door. Over the following days, Sarah settled into the quiet routine of the foundation. The initial stiffness between her and Emily didn't dissolve overnight, but began to shift in subtle ways. Emily noticed how Sarah kept her head down during group meals, speaking only when addressed, and how she always positioned the baby stroller within arm's reach, as though afraid someone might take him away. She attended the mandatory orientation sessions and signed up for several workshops, but her guarded posture never faltered. Emily respected that distance. She knew trust was something earned slowly, not demanded. One late afternoon, Emily found herself in the kitchen restocking shelves when she saw Sarah hesitating in the doorway. The scent of fresh bread lingered in the air, and the low hum of conversation from a nearby room filled the silence between them. Sarah stepped inside, adjusting the baby's blanket as he slept against her shoulder. "They said you're the one who approves program placements," Sarah said, her tone careful. "I am," Emily replied, closing a cabinet and turning toward her. "What are you thinking of applying for?" "The vocational training program. I used to do bookkeeping. I'm rusty, but I could get back into it." Emily nodded, reaching for a form on the counter. "We can arrange that. There's a class starting next week. You'll need childcare coverage during those hours, but we have volunteers for that." She handed over the paper, watching as Sarah accepted it without quite meeting her eyes. There was a pause, and then Sarah said quietly, "I didn't expect you to not turn me away." Emily studied her cousin for a moment, the memory of that long-ago Christmas like a faint echo rather than a fresh wound. "Here," she said evenly, "we don't ask where you came from. We ask where we want to go." The words were not rehearsed. They came from the same place that had built this entire foundation, an understanding that the past might shape you, but it didn't have to define where you ended up. Sarah's gaze lifted then, and something in her expression softened. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a recognition. She took a slow breath and said, "I want to go somewhere my son can feel safe, somewhere I can stand on my own again." "Then we start there," Emily replied. Over the next weeks, their interactions became more frequent. Sarah joined a bookkeeping class and, to Emily's quiet satisfaction, excelled in it. She began helping in the foundation's small office, entering data and balancing donation records. The work gave her a steadier rhythm, and Emily noticed she began to talk more with the other residents, laughing occasionally in the common room. The baby, now more familiar to everyone, was passed gently from arm to arm during group activities. One evening, as the foundation prepared for its annual winter dinner, Emily found Sarah in the main hall helping to set tables. The room glowed with soft light strung along the walls, and the air was rich with the scent of roasted vegetables and spices. Sarah was arranging place settings, her son asleep in a carrier against her chest. "You're good at this," Emily remarked, stepping beside her. Sarah gave a faint smile. "I guess it's easier to make a place feel like home when someone lets you in the door." Emily didn't respond immediately, but she felt the truth of the words settle between them. For years, she had defined family as something you built through choice, not just inherited by blood. And here was the proof. Sarah was no longer the girl who had once excluded her with a thoughtless remark, just as Emily was no longer the young woman who had left in silence. Later that night, as the hall filled with residents, volunteers, and supporters, Emily looked around at the tables. Conversations overlapped, children darted between chairs, and music played softly in the background. Sarah sat with a group from her class, her baby cradled in her arms, and when their eyes met across the room, there was no tension, only a quiet acknowledgement. Emily knew that forgiveness didn't erase history, but in that moment, it didn't need to. What mattered was that Sarah had been given a chance to rebuild, and she had taken it. And for Emily, that was the essence of family. Not obligation, not pretense, but the deliberate choice to stand beside someone when they needed it most. The night wound down with the soft shuffle of coats and the sound of goodbyes. As Emily locked the front door, she thought of all the women who had passed through these halls, each carrying their own history, each leaving with a piece of the foundation in them. She thought of Sarah and of the journey that had brought them both to this point, and she felt certain more than ever that the true meaning of family was not something given. It was something made, one choice at a time.